Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 17. My name is Timothy Zaccagnino. I'll be hosting for you today, and I've got both of the boys on the line, fresh out of the Warhammer gates with Christopher Sofsky, and off of our alchemy rant with Teld from last week. How are we doing today, gentlemen?
Well, Tim, I gotta say, I think you really fucked up just now.
Hey, you can't drop an F-bomb in the first minute of YouTube without them flagging you.
You got to give enough time for the censors to get bored and stop listening.
What did I do wrong? What did I do?
Okay. Well, the thing that you fucked up, Tim, is that I took my opportunity to interrupt you trying to start the recording. Teld took his opportunity to interrupt you, but you didn't take the opportunity to interrupt yourself.
No, he did first. He's the one that started all of this.
Is he?
I'm pretty sure I interrupted myself first.
Oh.
Well, if you want, I can do a record scratch here and then restart from the top.
Okay, perfect. Or you could do something like you could be in the middle of the sentence and you could be like, hold on, Tim, I want to say something.
Sorry, folks, we lost Chris today. His recording stopped working, so we're going to operate.
Unfortunate.
Just go ahead and mute Chris at this point. Are you guys ready to talk about some taboo Magic the Gathering cards? The bad boys, the no-nos of the Unrestricted Cube?
We're calling them taboo now, huh? That sounds a little Protestant to me.
Yeah, I wanted to be a little salacious.
Okay.
And look, they're not just bad boys. There's some ladies on here too.
Oh yeah, Winota is just as bad as any of the boys on here, and
we've also got the sexiest lady in Magic the Gathering, according to Mop, on this list.
Mop has opinions on the sex appeal of Magic the Gathering cards.
Yeah, do you want to guess which card it is? I'll give you a hint. It's a 13-13.
Oh man, he's been watching watching a little bit too much niche Japanese erotica, huh?
Yeah, he's there's this running joke for whatever reason that he's super into Emrakul, and it's at the point where we think he's actually just super into Emrakul. All right, Banlist time. So again, Banlist, soft ban, we're going to put these all in air quotes because there are no cards that are truly, well, there's a very small subset of cards that are truly banned from the Unrestricted Cube. A lot of cards are out temporarily until certain circumstances happen that they could be allowed in, but there is actually a small subset of cards that as long as Chris and I and Teld are all standing, living individuals, they will never see the light of day in the Unrestricted Cube. Plus, thanks to Mop curating the now named Timeless Cube, formerly the the Fun Restricted Cube, there is a home for a lot of the cards that we are talking about today. The Timeless Cube is kind of anything goes, the actual truly unrestricted cube. So,
and a lot of these are complete powerhouses in that format, which should tell you why they are not in the lower powered environment.
Yeah. So part of the reason I pitched this episode to you guys is that I wouldn't say it irritates me, but I get a little bit tired of people who come into the community and they just say the blanket statement, why aren't you playing this card? Why aren't you playing X? Why aren't you playing Y? Why isn't this card here? I expect this card to be here. This card's super powerful. And this is hopefully a way to wrap up all the different reasons why we don't play a certain subset of cards. And it's not always just that the card's too powerful, right? It's easy to say the ban list is just all the best, most powerful broken cards. And I think that's a little disingenuous. Some of the cards we're going to talk about today aren't actually broken necessarily. They just don't fit the parameters of what we want in our cube. And final little caveat here, we're not going to talk about alchemy because all of those cards are broken.
Also, you guys just spent some time on that.
Yeah, I didn't want to make this an additional alchemy rant after doing an alchemy rant for our last bonus episode. So we're not going to talk about any alchemy cards at all here. So it's just actual, real, factual Magic the Gathering cards. I did want to, real quick, so obviously I want to plug our Discord, the Jank Diver Gaming Discord. It's a great place to have opinions. But if you guys will entertain this, I also wanted to shout out a new initiative that I started in the Discord, which is running under the temporary name of Brawlbarians. What this is I wanted to get our community playing Brawl because it felt like there were enough people who were interested in that format and played it kind of casually as their constructed format of choice. And what we designed was a stipulation-based league where people build brawl decks. The way the stipulations work is we invited about 10 people to join our first league, kind of as a trial run. Each person who joined was allowed to offer 2 stipulations, things like, all the creatures in your deck have to share a creature type, or you can only play Grixis colors, or you have to have like an affinity style deck with X number of artifacts. Like, people got to design their own stipulations, and we combined 2 of them randomly as the first set of stipulations for our deck building restriction. And Teld, I think we landed on a tribal thing where everything in your deck had to share a creature type, and you had to play at least 20 creatures of that type. And then the second stipulation was
you couldn't have cards from the either Jank, Diver, Peasant Cube.
Oh, yeah, you had to exclude the cards that we normally play in our Peasant Cube. So everybody built a deck using those parameters. We had a bunch of human decks. We had an elf deck. I had a wizard's deck. Teld had like a kind of enchantress-based human deck. Everybody came up with really cool decks, played against each other, and the winner, who at this point is almost assuredly T-Pug, gets to pick the next round of stipulations, and that's how we're going to go forward with it. So,
which, just wanted to point a shout out to T-Pug. I've never seen someone have as hot of every time, including against me, every time he hit a Discover trigger, it was just like, what is the, like, it was basically Demonic Tutor with a Black Lotus staple to it. He had Tally's favored a hero of the Nyxborn into a Sanctuary lockdown against me, and I was like, well, I'm pretty favored here until he got like a permanent on the job.
Yeah. But basically, this whole thing is stipulation-based brawl decks, and every 2 weeks we're going to cycle through a new set of stipulations where the winner gets to decide kind of the structure of the next league, and people just build some brawl decks and play against each other. Super casual, though some people obviously wanted to spike it. I wanted to give a plug there. I think it'd be really cool to get a couple more people to join up so we can fragment off into smaller leagues rather than really big leagues where you have to play against like 10 to 12 people over and over again. So I wanted to throw that out here. It seemed like people had a ton of fun with the first wave of decks that we built, and it seems like people are really excited to get into the second wave. We don't know what the stipulations are going to be yet, but the first one was a really cool deck building exercise. So if you like playing Brawl and you like building decks and you like playing just casually against other people, come join the Discord community. And it's a nice alternative to all of the other cubes related stuff that we do. So
if you're concerned about wild cards, we did elect to do the main rules are going to be peasant. There could be stipulations that allow for rares, but week to week we would expect it to be peasant based gameplay, so that way your wild cards are safe.
Yeah. On to the main topic. Ban cards, soft ban cards, whatever you want to call them. What we're going to do is, instead of talking about every single individual card, oh, this is banned because blank, this is banned because blank, what we wanted to do was go through some categories of why cards get banned, and then touch on the types of examples that fall into those categories. That way we're not just talking about 50 to 60 Magic the Gathering cards and then going over why they're banned for exactly the same reasons over and over. So, gentlemen, do one of you guys want to kick us off by talking about some of these categories that we use to kind of classify how we ban cards?
Sure. As Tim mentioned, there are some cards that I will straight up refer to as banned, like Over My Dead Body. But in a broader sense, these are cards that we've sidelined because of the impact that they have on the cube's gameplay or our intended design goals or whatever. So the first of these sort of macro categories is highly polar cards. We did an entire episode on the problems around polar cards, and I won't reiterate all that here, but suffice it to say that we are broadly of the opinion that unless for some reason it's serving a very specific design goal that you have, or a color imbalance problem or something, playing cards that are really, really, really good in some circumstances and really not effective at all in others are just not cards you should be dedicating slots to. So an example of a polar card would be something like Esper Sentinel, which is a 1-mana 1/1 that essentially says, the first time that your opponent casts a non-creature spell on any given turn, they have to pay mana equal to Esper Sentinel's power, which is usually 1 unless you have equipment or whatever going on. And if they don't or can't, you draw a card. Against a green deck, this card is absolutely terrible. for the most part. You're going to play your 1-mana 1/1, and they're going to curve out oversized creatures, and you're not going to draw any cards, and you're going to have played flying man that doesn't fly, essentially.
Man.
Just man. Just literal man.
You played man.
You know what? Next time somebody plays Esper Sentinel in some context, it should just be like, man enters the chat. But in any case, yeah, so like the card is excellent to the point of being super punishing against like controlling decks that are playing a bunch of cheap removal and stuff, and then other decks are just going to completely and utterly ignore them. Like an even more extreme example, in my opinion, would be something like Teferi Time Raveler, which is 3 mana for a Planeswalker. You can minus it to bounce a thing and draw a card, and then its +1 makes you able to play sorceries at instant speed. And essentially, like, the reason that I'm calling this card out as polar is, like, 3 mana to make a Planeswalker that bounces a thing and draws a card is, like, not an inherently bad rate. But this card also has a static that says your opponents cannot play non-creature spells at instant speed or something to that effect. So, like, in a control matchup, if you land this, like, your opponent just can't counter anything anymore, which is awful. Whereas against, like, a green deck, the only relevance that Teferi really has other than the bounce thing, draw a card, is that, like, you can maybe Wrath at instant speed or something and get them. But, yeah. Another subcategory of what I would consider polarity is, like, play-draw polarity. And the first example that comes to mind is a card that we cut recently, which is 2-mana Magda. It's a 2/1. It's essentially, it's a 2/1 that when it attacks, it creates a treasure token. So in the event that you play this on turn 2 on the play against a slower deck, like, this can quickly completely spiral out of control and basically be like a 2/1 that, like, generated 3 free mana over the course of a game, which is wild. However, if you play it on the draw or you play it after turn 2, in a lot of board states, it's effectively a 2/1 for 2. So just, again, another example of a polar card. Under certain circumstances, specifically in this case surrounding, like, when you play the card, it's awesome, versus at other points in the game or being on the draw is just not good.
And I want to point out there, too, that some of the cards you named are not, like, egregious power outliers, right?
No.
I don't think anyone's calling Magda or Esper Sentinel, like, insanely overpowered cards. They just are not things that fit our design goals necessarily because of their polarity. We don't like polarity in our cube to, like, such a high degree. We would prefer that most cards in our cube operate equally across matchups and across different phases of a game. Again, I think it's episode 14. You can go listen to all of our thoughts on polarity and the different categories of polarity, but for the most part, that's just a fine little summary. Plus, Teferi Time Raveler is an example of a card that we didn't ban from the cube because of its play patterns. It's a card that's never been in the cube at all because we recognize, you know, it's just not the type of card that we want here.
Yeah, the only card that I just brought up that I would say is, like, literally banned is Time Raveler, because its whole deal is it completely shuts down the ability to play an entire style of Magic.
Well, in addition, the floor on that card is really high, right? Because like, even in the bad case, you just, like, come down and you bounce a 2-drop and you recycle it, and then maybe it soaks some damage. Like, it ends up being kind of like in worst case, it's like 3 mana, bounce something, draw a card, gained like 2 to 3 life.
Yeah, exactly.
So those are polar cards. How about the swingy ones?
Yeah. So swingy cards kind of have 2 big categories, but basically the idea is these are cards that just completely flip a game on its head and put you from a position of being, like, probably either at parity or even behind into a winning position. This includes some cards, for example, that would be like Bonehorde Dracasaur is a card we elected not to play for this reason. Big giant dragon that's gonna, in the game very quickly, but that isn't actually the problematic part. It's the level to which, like, if you untap with this card, you just generate so much advantage. It's hard to attack into, so it you kind of just puts you on a Doomblade check. These are what we oftentimes refer to as must die to Doomblade, which is kind of the next evolution of dies to Doomblade. It used to be one of the criticisms against stat sticky or, like, long-term engine cards that were expensive was that they just die to Doomblade. But we've reached a point in the power level now where a lot of these cards just either die to your opponent's removal spell or they take over the game completely. And while for 5 and 6 mana cards, it's okay for them to have a big game impact, the sort of way that this one works, where if your opponent has the Go for the Throat, for example, you get blown out, and if they don't, you win the game. It just isn't fun. So the other way this looks is the we call it the oops I win buttons. These are cards that just literally take you from, it does not matter what position you were in before, you're probably winning now. The most egregious of these is Sunfall. It's the best Wrath ever printed. It is a card that will take you from losing positions into substantially winning positions. Like, not just, Sunfall like breaks the Wrath parity where Wraths are supposed to reset you to even unless you have some sort of long-term value, but it gives you the long-term value by that incubate token, which allows you to immediately impact the board afterwards. So these are the kind of cards. There's other ones, something like, for example, the 1313 Spaghetti Mom. You know, it will certainly flip a game on its head and take you from a losing position into a dominating position. There's other cards like that, but that's sort of what those would look like. These are very much grown test cards. These are the cards your opponent casts it and you're just like, oh, Lord.
It's like, oh, well, I guess the everything that happened up to this point in the game didn't matter.
Exactly. They give you that traditional, like, limited retail draft feel of, like, oh, the big bomb rare invalidated everything that happened up to this point.
Yeah, like, I actually... So, like, a couple things. I have a personal story with Sunfall where, like, the short version is I was playing, like, a white aggressive deck, and I had a bunch of creatures on board, but my green opponent had just, like, vomited out like 4 or 5 like gigantic creatures that were going to kill me the next turn, and then I drew the Sunfall that I had sideboarded in and cast it and wiped the board and made a 13/13 for 2 mana. So yeah, I can imagine that they were doing some swearing there. And then like another example of kind of like these swingy like oops I win type cards, Wormcoil Engine. When we had this in the cube, it's a card I would actually sometimes like apologize to my opponent for playing, because like the game was so obviously theirs. Like their deck did the thing, they did it faster than me, they were supposed to win, and then I played Wormcoil Engine. It's like, well, I can't die now, so I actually feel bad.
Cards that make your players feel bad are cards that you should consider probably not having in your cube, but that's just me. Probably a good time to mention, too, that a lot of these categories overlap, obviously. The next category, if you guys want to talk about Mullslayers here, first off, it probably behooves the audience for you guys to explain what a Mullslayer actually means. Mm-hmm. It's pretty self-explanatory to some people, but I think that's a term that you guys actually coined here. Yeah. That may not be immediately apparent to somebody.
So Mullslayers, as Tim mentioned, can be swingy cards, but like oftentimes they're not swingy in the way that like what I kind of think of as like nuclear Baneslayers, like Bone Horde, are. And these are generally green. Like, let's be very clear, they're generally green cards. And what they usually are is very large bodies or like above adequate bodies for the cost of mana that also generate immediate value, that creates a situation where you kind of have to remove the thing to not die to it, but they also drew cards or created like a card's worth of value over them ETBing. So if you're trying to keep up with them, they're basically they're Baneslayers that if you're trying to keep up with them by casting removal, like you're always getting farther and farther behind.
Historically in Magic, there's the Mulldrifter to Baneslayer axis, right, of cards that are good in combat and will win the game that way versus cards that generate value. And Mullslayer comes about from being the poor man 2 of those, right? It's a Mullslayer is a Mulldrifter. It generates value when it enters the battlefield, but also it's a Baneslayer because it is a very large stat stick. And while it's not as big of a stat stick as some of the pure modern Baneslayers, it's still enough that it will probably win the game on its own, if not promptly dealt with.
Right. So, like, an example, and, like, this isn't like an example like Vorinclex, where it's, like, literally just huge and draws forests, which is also, like, really, really powerful. But the card I wanted to bring up is one that we cut relatively recently called Radagast the Brown. So, Radagast is essentially 4 mana for a 2/5, which is not, like, a world-breaking stat line, but 5 toughness is a lot when you're trying to block anything that's trying to kill you. Like, aggro decks, like, have to kill this body to ever damage you again. And when it ETBs, you look at the top number of cards of your library where, like, X is the mana value of the creature entering the battlefield. And then you can put a creature card into your hand if it doesn't share a creature type with anything you already have on board. So, like, Radagast is an avatar wizard, which are not common types in green. So Radagast comes down, it's 4 mana 2/5, and generally speaking, you're looking at your top 4 and you're just putting your best creature into your hand. And not only that, but it triggers anytime any other creature enters the battlefield. So that's just like snowball value on top. But at its base, if it was just a 2/5 for 4 that impulse the top of your deck for the best creature in the top 4. Like, that's already a pretty solid card. So, significant body, draws more bodies as you play more bodies.
Yeah, answer it or get buried, basically.
Exactly. Yep.
Which does snowball into our next category, which are snowbally cards, but specifically cheap snowbally cards, the ones that come down like turn 1, 2, 3 specifically, and either you have the answer right away or they just give you like an insurmountable advantage early in the game. Like Ragavan is like the most obvious example, right? It's the turn 1, like, do you have the answer? If not, I'm so far ahead of you that you might not be able to come back. And it's not like Ragavan always does that either. Like sometimes you just kill Ragavan, or sometimes you play a 1/1 and it's like Ragavan can't get the attack, and it's just the opportunities it presents for you to actually win the game when your opponent can't present the answer to it just leads to like these non-games. And we would hope that we're not inviting people out to our Discord server to play non-games. Like we just want to minimize that as much as possible. So these snowbally threats are just not cards that interest us personally. People do love their Ragavans though. Like you'll see cards like this a lot in other people's cubes.
People who are playing Magic and keeping up with stats are probably aware of the play draw disparity. You know, in current Magic, the difference between being on the play versus the draw is something like 10%. So these are cards that sort of like those play draw polar cards that we talked about, which Ragavan is a different kind of card because it isn't just dead later into the game. You can still set up situations in which it still does value, just like something like an Inti or a Luminarch Aspirant does. The whole thing is these are cards that exacerbate the play draw dilemma. And we're always looking for ways to reduce that sort of play draw disparity so that it's a little closer to 50-50. There's always going to be an advantage in Magic to being able to cast your more expensive card first and get on the board first. But modern Magic design has really pushed into that lane and really exacerbated it.
Yeah, I mean, do you guys enjoy games being over on turn 1? Because I sure do.
So many more matches when games only last one turn.
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of cards that fit this bill of cheap snowball. The reason we're calling out Ragavan specifically is it's like literally the cheapest snowball that is actually until they print like Phyrexian Mana Radagast, which I'm sure, give it 2 years they will. Radagast, comes down on turn 1, and then if your opponent does not have like a turn 1 blocker or a turn 1 removal spell, it just like instantaneously pays for itself, and then it's all upside from there. It's just a fucking obnoxious card. I hate this card. I hate everything about this card. But anyway, we can move on.
And the listener will note that Chris took the jump from Phyrexian Ragavan straight to Phyrexian Radagast. So
yeah. Yep.
Which is even more egregious.
That would also be good.
Are you willing to pay 8 life to have a Radagast on turn 1?
I would. I'd start at 10 life to have Radagast and play on turn 1. The next category is kind of a self-explanatory one that I think a lot of people don't disagree. Some people might disagree that like cutting cards for a lot of the reasons we've mentioned up to this point is like not necessary, but I think the uninteractable category is the one that most people unanimously agree is like, cut these cards. Don't play cards that your opponent just straight up can't interact with. So for example, when Chris and I first built the Unrestricted Cube, we said no way to Dream Trawler, right? Because it's just a card that if it resolves and you have cards in your hand, your opponent is just dead out of the water. We also played Avabrook Caretaker for a little while. I think even Carnage Tyrant was in the cube for a little while. And it's like, these are cards that cut off certain players' abilities to interact with them in a way that just leads to unfun binary gameplay where the thing that resolved is now just winning the game like on its own and you can't do anything about it. It's just not like we cut Giver of Runes for that reason, right? Protection is just not. It's a good ability. It's a very strong ability, but it is not a fun ability to play with. Like it just gives you a little bit too much, especially like on-demand protection, like Giver of Runes. That's where it starts to get really egregious.
On top, Giver being able to block was also a surprisingly big deal because we do still run Skrelv, who can kind of run a similar interference. But because Skrelv is a 1/1 that can't block, it neither attacks nor blocks well, right? And so you're basically, the opportunity cost of putting that card in your deck is that most of the time Skrelv is like almost like an enchantment that is easier to interact with, right? It's just a card that gives you that feature, but like Giver of Runes being able to block came up a lot. It came up a ton where it just would block, your opponent's 1/1s or, your opponent's trade off with a 2/1, being able to give the protection on demand and creating like, once you have two of these creatures in the cube, it gets really awkward because one of the issues with Mother of Runes is that if you untap with that card, it creates these really awkward spots because you can't interact with the Mother of Runes because it can just protect itself. And these sort of created that same scenario where like if you tried to interact with Giver, Skrelv could protect it. And so like having two of these in the cube also was pretty unhealthy.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing about uninteractable cards is they're also kind of inherently polar cards because they punish decks that need to interact to win more than decks that don't. But even so, Carnage Tyrant is obviously like an explicit control hoser, but it's still kind of rough against your white aggro deck too, right? Because you can't kill it with removal, and like you have to tangle with a 7/6 trample in combat to deal with it, which is also brutal. So these cards just kind of suck. They're not fun.
Talk to me about the Overturned cards, which honestly are kind of self-explanatory.
Yeah, Simply Overtuned is just like, holy shit, this card just does entirely too much for how much it costs. Fable is arguably one of these cards. I actually, what I think might be a better example is like Robo Nissa, because you could argue like Fable is like a value generator and does a variety of different things, and it all adds up to being greater than some of its parts. Robo Nissa is literally just like a planeswalker that produces unreasonably huge tokens every single turn in this incredibly boring way that just like, here's my planeswalker that I cast for 5. That's immediately going to make a 4/4, and then a 5/5, and then a 6/6, and a 7/7 as it's upticking. There's nothing particularly like dynamic about that card. It's just like, why does this card make so many gigantic bodies on top of having its ultimate be Craterhoof Behemoth? It's just too much juice for how much it costs.
I would argue Fable is probably the most clear example of Overtuned because I think we were talking before the podcast, and I actually agree that, Chris, you were saying that Fable doesn't meet any of the other criteria, whereas I think all of the other cards on this list pretty much meet other criteria in addition to being overtuned. I would argue that being overtuned is the single biggest reason a card gets removed, right? Because like being snowbally it's kind of inherently annoying, but we do run cards like Luminarch Aspirate and Inti's on our watch list, but it is in the cube, and these are snowbally cards. But they have they crossed the line? Breaches is another one where it's like we're keeping a close eye on it, but like have they crossed the line in terms of snowballiness? All right, and then like we run some cards that probably qualify as Mullslayers, and we run some cards that qualify as polar, to some extent, depending, and I think the overtuned part is actually might be the most important part of all of these cards because they do these things while also being incredibly powerful and pushed at doing that thing.
Yeah. So no, I actually, Teld, I think that's an awesome point. Whereas like Fable is just, it doesn't really fit any of these other categories necessarily super neatly, but it is overtuned insofar as it makes a better Magda, filters your hand, and then creates a creature duplicating engine, not to mention like 2/2/2s for 3 mana, which is like, it's not interactable, it's not necessarily snowbally, it's not necessarily swingy, it's just, here's 3 mana for this massive pile of shit you now have to deal with that you can't one for one. Yeah, okay, I take your point.
I did want to ask you guys, do you think Phyrexian Nissa and Phyrexian Radagast hang out together?
Oh, for sure.
Almost.
They have a behind closed doors inappropriate relationship.
Oh, okay.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Okay, someone call Mop.
Nissa's into older guys.
Talk to me. You landed on the label of like vintage Magic. We had a little bit of trouble talking about this category, but talk to me about the cards that like kind of don't fit the context of what the rest of the cube is doing.
Sure. So I teach math to high school students as part of my job, right? And so when we're teaching algebra, there's the X and the Y axis, right? And you graph your point, you make a line. But there's also a Z axis that we don't talk about in Algebra 1. And these are cards that operate on the Z-axis. These are the 3-dimensional cards. They're playing on an entirely different plane of reality than the other kind of cards. And we spent some time trying to think about how to describe this. And Vintage Magic came up because these are cards that are frequently played in Vintage Cube. These are cards that just do a thing that is fundamentally unfair, usually violating the rules around mana is the biggest thing. Like, these are your channels, your dark rituals, your show and tells. These are cards that just they're cheaty, right? They feel unfair. And in our environment, this also incorporates a demonic tutor, because while I think that card in some contexts could be fair, what happened in our cube environment is that our black sack decks would function like a combo deck, and demonic tutor just added a layer of consistency and resiliency to enable them to have this unfair draw that they would otherwise naturally have to draw into with a bunch of moving parts. Having one of those parts be whatever part you're missing was really, really powerful. So that's kind of where we're at on those cards. These are just cards that are just fundamentally not playing the same kind of game as everything else.
We talked about this a little bit in our second Build a Cube series episode, where these are cards that make sense when they're surrounded by each other, but don't make sense when there's like one of them in isolation in an otherwise fair cube. So for example, when Strixhaven came out, we played Natural Order in our Unrestricted Cube, and there was this deck that could go like, close your ears, Chris. Turn 1 Gilded Goose was your, 1 mana accelerant of choice, and then turn 3 Natural Order into Coma. And that was something that pretty much no deck could beat unless they had like Swords to Plowshares right then and there. And it was very clear right off the bat, after seeing that twice, maybe 3 times, that was operating in a completely different axis than what the rest of our cube was doing. It would make a lot more sense if we also had Channel in the cube, if we also had Sneak Attack in the cube, like what we see in the Timeless Cube, where there's a bunch of different decks doing this, so you can plan accordingly. But when there's only one card in a cube that's doing something that's just operating in a completely different space than what the other 359 cards in your cube are doing, it really doesn't make sense to keep that there, because then you just end up in these situations where you drafted this fair deck and you just so happen to get paired against somebody who has this unfair combo in their deck, or whatever you want to call it, and they just win the game against you because they assembled those cards. So it leads to very binary results, which we're not a big fan of. So I don't have a problem with these cards on an individual level. I only have a problem when they're isolated as single cards in a cube and not surrounded by other cards that are in the same category in the same cube. So that wraps up kind of all of the main categories of why we ban cards. They're polar, they're swingy, they're unnecessary Mullslayers, they're cheap and snowbally. You can't interact with them. They're overtuned, or they're cards that are doing things that the rest of the cube isn't doing. So those are kind of the main categories, and what we're going to do now, without listing literally every single card, is just kind of go through a couple categories and talk about individual cards that highlight this. And we've kind of done that already with a few examples, but we do have ones that we specifically want to highlight here. Starting out with just the Polarizing Cards. Chris mentioned Thalia in this category. Actually, I don't think you said Thalia, but Thalia falls in this category. Esper Sentinel, aka Man, Teferi Time Raveler, Magda. These are good examples of Polarizing Cards. I think the one that we can all kind of unanimously talk about here is Bitter Blossom, which we've talked about on the podcast before, but it was a card that we were very excited to get. We kind of knew how it would play out in certain matchups. Like, it's not a hard card to parse out, like, from a theoretical standpoint, but we did play it. We found it to be problematic, partly because it's good against control, but also because it's just like, it fits a lot of these different categories, right? It's polarizing in the sense that it's insane on turn 2, but actually pretty bad if you draw it on like turn 6 a lot of the times. The control element is something that's specific to our environment, where the control decks just can't beat Bitter Blossom. And it got to the point where Bitter Blossom was just winning too often. A lot of times when we see a card win, like, every single week, that's when we have to like step back and say, why is this card doing what it's doing? Which of these categories does it fall in? And does it warrant a banning? And we decided to bring the hammer down on Bitter Blossom not too long ago.
Yeah, I mean, Bitter Blossom, Teld actually mentioned earlier when we were talking about this, and I think this is a good thing to observe, like, just fitting into one of these individual categories isn't unless it's really extreme, isn't necessarily like a sole reason we would take a look at a card. Like Teld mentioned, there being cheap snowbally cards that we've decided are like in bounds enough on like how snowbally they are, right? So just being a cheap snowball doesn't make you a card that we won't necessarily play. It's like how hard do you snowball and for how cheaply, So what I'm getting at is like a lot of these cards we're going to be talking about that fit into these individual categories are pushed over the line by the fact that they are also overtuned, which I would say Bitter Blossom is one of those. But yeah, as you mentioned, like Bitter Blossom on turn 2 on the play is fucking insane. It's polar in that way. And not to mention the fact that if you draw it on like turn 12 against another deck that really cares about your life total, in some cases is like it's an actual liability. But the biggest issue that we were having, and it was really pissing Teld off, is if you were playing like a slower blue deck into Bitter Blossom, you're just not really going to shut them down, right? Because you're not going to race them hard enough that the life loss is really going to matter. You're only going to have but so many flying blockers. Eventually, the number of bodies it produces is just going to be insurmountable. Like, even if you Wrath, like, it almost won't matter. And just kind of building a little bit more on the timing polarity of the card. Playing this on turn 2 in a 10-turn game means it's going to make, like, 7 1/1 flyers. Playing this on turn 12 in a game that goes 15 turns means it's 2 mana to make 2 flyers and take 2 damage, which is fine, but like...
Well, even at that point, you might not even be able to cast it depending on life totals.
Right, if you're playing against another aggressive deck or something like that. So, yep, Bitter Blossom, definitely a polarizing card. Teld, I know that this one was like a personal injury type card for you, if you have anything else you want to say about it.
I know. I just felt like I lost to this card a bunch. Like, the decks I like to draft just cannot ever beat this card. That is not to say that the decks I like to draft could otherwise 3-0 the cube. but the decks I enjoy playing would just like see this card on turn 2 and we could just basically concede on the spot.
Yeah, no, Bitter Blossom definitely. I had multiple moments with this too, whether they be in our own cube or the Arena Cube when it was online or against certain other Brawl decks. It's like, I'm on the draw, my opponent plays Bitter Blossom on turn 2, and my immediate emotional reaction is, well, okay. Tough card.
Yeah, a lot of that also is owing to the fact that it's an enchantment, right? The other, we've also listed like Shadow Spear as a polarizing card, which is an artifact, obviously, and our cube isn't like super dedicated to removing artifacts and enchantments. There's a couple niche cards here and there that can do it, and maybe like 1 or 2 actual dedicated cards for removing artifacts and enchantments. But it's worth noting, if Bitter Blossom was a creature instead of an enchantment, maybe it'd be a little bit more tolerable because it would just be open up to a larger number of interactive spells.
Tim, is this you arguing Emporium Thopterus for the Unrestricted Cube?
That's just better than Bitter Blossom, honestly.
But it's a creature, Tim. How bad could it be?
Yeah, it only makes O2s. How bad can it be? The only polarizing creature that I mentioned here is Misery Shadow, which was polarizing for a big different subset of reasons and wasn't unbeatable, but what does die to Fatal Push, you know?
I would make the argument that Misery Shadow, in my mind, falls a lot more into the simply overtuned camp than the polar camp. I think Misery Shadow is a simply overtuned card that also happens to be like, well, I guess your sacrifice deck's fucked. But Misery Shadow is literally miserable, like, regardless of matchup.
I think there's also a issue of like, we like when 2-drops are good later into the game, but there is something a little unreasonable about your opponent's 2-drop being able to legitimately like kill you from 10 in 1 turn.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, Misery Shadow is 1 and a black for a 2/2. For whatever reason, it has the extremely wide-ranging ability that, like, anytime a creature your opponent controls would die, it gets exiled. It doesn't matter if they sacrifice it, or you kill it, or if it interacted with Misery Shadow, or anything. It's just, if an opponent's creature would die, it gets exiled on a 2-drop. But the main issue with it is it's literally 1 generic mana to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. It's not even black, it's just generic. So from the time that Misery Shadow hits the battlefield, anytime you attack with it, your opponent has to decide whether or not they want to give you an opportunity to just eat their blockers. And if they don't block, then you can use any mana that you were not planning on spending on actual cards to just like get in extra damage with Misery Shadow. It's nearly impossible to block. It's very difficult to attack into, not to mention the fact that like there are some strategies that rely on death triggers that it just literally shuts down. But that's mostly a side dish to this card is the most obnoxious combat math card like maybe ever printed.
But I think this is a good one to shout out because it looks like a card that like the hoser text is the reason we didn't include it. Although, and that was a big deal to it. It was annoying, but like it's one of those things you have to actually play against the card to recognize how obnoxious the ability to pump it is.
Yeah, it just has Fireball attached to it. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Misery Shadow before. Like, I think the card would still have been quite strong if the pump had been amended to cost black mana.
Or if it only gave power.
Or if it, well, yeah, if it only gave power, I think you're talking about a very different card at that point. But if they made you decide, like, okay, not just do I have enough mana to pump this, but do I have enough black mana to pump this and also like do what I want to do this turn, it would still be good. And I think even on top of that, it would still be good if the creature, if a creature would die exile instead, was like limited to creatures that died in combat with Misery Shadow. Like that would still be strong. But it wouldn't be like, hey, nice Blood Artist triggers or whatever.
This is a card where all the individual parts came together to make a miserable experience. What is the like negative version of like using the whole buffalo? Because this card definitely uses the whole buffalo, but every part of the buffalo is like tainted meat or something like that.
The Phyrexian buffalo?
The Phyrexian buffalo, yeah. Like this is every part of the card matters in a way that is like feel bad moment for your opponent. Like sometimes your opponent plays this on turn 2 and you just don't have a way to deal with it.
And like it seems like the kind of card that would be like, you'd be like, all right, my control deck's gonna roll this, right? I'm just gonna fatal push this and we're good. But like what ends up happening is your opponent top decks it on like turn 8 and both of you have like one card in hand and you're just out of removal and you've got like a blocker or two and then your opponent's like, okay, you're under the abyss, good luck.
Yeah, another play pattern, and people don't really draft the blue-black tempo deck, but when I have in the past, I've like had Misery Shadow in my deck, and it's fucking insane there because you can protect it with counter magic, but not only that, like you don't have to play another creature for the rest of the game. You just attack, and like if you're on 4 mana, it's just like, okay, well I guess you didn't block. I'll spend 2 mana to do 2 additional damage to you, and I'm just gonna hold up counter spell now. So it just like it can be a threat when backed up by counter magic that it's like the only thing that matters on the battlefield for the rest of the game. Last thing I'll say about it is like this is an example of a card, and we'll be talking about a lot of cards like this where we're gonna put it in an individual category, but like the truly egregious cards like violate multiple of these principles at the same time.
For sure, which does bring us to the next category of the Snowballing Threats, which Snowballing Threats are some of the ones that do they absolutely violate multiple categories. Sometimes the Mullslayers are snowbally cards too, right? But which one do you guys think is best? We've talked about Ragavan, we talked about Radagast, like Nissa, Robo Nissa. Is there one here that you guys think like exemplifies what we're talking about with snowbally threats?
I sort of like talking about Eska's Chariot because I still see this one in a lot of cubes, and I kind of like with relative power level 2Rs, and I don't know if those cubes have had enough reps. You resolve an Eska's Chariot and you're like, man, this card is messed up. It does not take very many times.
It's in the Arena Cube. Chris was like rocking people with Eska's Chariot in Arena Cube.
It's so fun. I mean, whatever. Like the poor design choices of official Arena Cubes could be like a series of ranty episodes unto itself. But the problem with Eska's Chariot is manyfold. So if Eska's Chariot was just like a 4/4 vehicle with crew 4 that made 2/2/2 cat tokens, that would still be a pretty solid card, I think. Like, it's a 4/4 that brings in the stats it needs to crew itself without dragging any other of your creatures into it. And then if you attack with a 4/4, which needs to be rumbled in with combat, when you trade with it or whatever, then your opponent's like left behind with like 2/2/2 cats.
Yeah, it's like a better version of the Eldraine Carriage.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, Chris wants Eska's Chariot to be the enchanted carriage.
I mean, like, I don't know if a 4/4 vehicle that just brought in 2/2/2s would be like crazy good, but like that's still pretty solid because like you have to eventually tangle with all those stats in combat. But beyond that, every time it attacks, it copies a token, which like I've seen some pretty absurd stuff where people are like copying 6/6 tokens and shit, which is just nuts. But even in like a complete vacuum, it's like, okay, it's everything that we just mentioned before, but the first time that it attacks and you have to tangle with this 4/4 in combat, it just like makes another 2/2.
And it sounds like the kind of thing that this is the kind of thing that I think escapes some people when they're evaluating the card is you get 2 tokens, right? That sounds like, oh yeah, you're just reading the card. But like when you actually play the game, what ends up happening is even if you had a removal spell, right, for one of the tokens, if this only made one token, because they did actually alchemy change this into a card I did like. So when they alchemy changed it, they made it where it only made one token. It cost crew 2 to crew. So they just halved the amount of value you got for free. And it made the card much, much worse, but also it wasn't a strict downgrade, right? Because it was cheaper to crew. You can still crew it with what it made. But if you had a single removal spell and your opponent didn't have another way to make tokens, you could block them off of making the snowbally value, which was a cool way of fixing the card. Because the reason is you just cannot, it's almost impossible for one card to answer all this that's going on or even stop them from generating value.
Yeah, I can't think of a single card that does clean this up for one card that's not named Farewell.
Yeah, I mean, it's a straight up 3-for-1, right? Like, the only way you beat a 3-for-1 is with a 3-for-1 of your own.
Right.
Which, part of this being, like, the main part of this being an artifact that's not a creature at sorcery speed means it dodges wraths. You know, like, I think we'd be fine with a number of 3-for-1s that just put a bunch of creatures on board. Like, Grave Titan's a 3-for-1, right? But it gets
also
completely...
costs 6.
Yeah, it costs almost twice as much mana, and it can be answered by a single card.
Also, it's got the polarity, right? Because even if, like, say you both had an Escus Chariot, the person who plays the Escus Chariot first gets to attack with their Escus Chariot, and now if you want to block, they're up a tokens. Like, you just win every exchange with your Escus Chariot. Like,
yeah, the big offender here is that, like, it just can't be answered by a single card. Best case scenario, I think, for us is you Kolaghan's Command or Prismari Command, the vehicle, and the cat, and you're still have the other 2/2 to deal with. And that's assuming it never got an attack in as well. Whereas cards like other cards in this category, those snowbally cheap threats, Lelia, Adeline, Ragavan, you can technically answer those right away. They don't leave anything behind. Or maybe they get the first attack in and Adeline leaves behind the 1/1, or Lelia drew you an extra card or something like that, and then you answer it. Escus Chariot, you have to answer 3 individual parts, which just makes it like super egregious. The type of card I think could have been fixed a lot too by like making it GG instead of single G. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it'd still be very powerful in green decks, but like you could just splash Escus Chariot in whatever deck you want, and it's going to be really good. It's just it falls in that overtuned category as well, where it's just too many stats, too many things on board at its mana cost.
Yeah, you mentioned another card that I just want to touch on real quick in this category, Lelia. 3 mana for a 2/2 with haste. Anytime one or more cards is exiled from your library or graveyard, it gets +1+, which is actually really, really funny with Necropotence. It's really funny with Necropotence. It's actually kind of like a combo kill in my Prosper deck. And I've actually missed lethal with this on board because I like just forgot that I could have just like Necropotenced away like 5 cards and just instantly won. But yeah, it's a 2/2 with haste, and it gets +1/+1 counter every time a card gets exiled from your library or graveyard, and then when you attack, it impulse draws the top card of your library. So it comes down as a 3/3 haste, pretty much, if you can attack with it, and immediately starts drawing cards, and as it's drawing cards, it's getting bigger, so like it itself can solo the game while it's drawing cards that are going to help you back it up and win the game. And it's also, I would argue that it's polar insofar as, like, on turn 3, it's fucking completely nuts. Sometimes on, like, turn 7 or 8 against, like, an opposing green deck, you just draw it, and it's like, okay, well, this is, like, a 3-mana 2/2 that I literally can't attack with. And it becomes, like, at that point, like, a 3-mana cantrip, like a 3-mana bad cantrip. But it's just one of those cards where it's like, okay, like, it's either going to come down, and under some circumstances, it's going to completely raffle stomp. And even in games where it doesn't do that, it's still pretty good. So, like, Lelia is fucking egregious. We will never put it back in this cube.
Yeah, a lot of these cards, when you ask the question, like, what's the best case scenario for the card, which is not how I normally evaluate things, but what is the best case scenario for this card? And the answer is it wins the game on its own.
For 3 mana.
Yeah, especially when it's lower on the curve. That's a pretty big red flag. Like, best case scenario for Grave Titan is it wins the game on its own, but it's also 6 mana. You have to do work. You have to survive to the point where you get to cast a 6 mana spell. You do not have to survive to the point where you cast a Ragavan on turn 1.
And right. One thing we've noticed that's increasingly true of Modern Magic is because it's so fast, the mana curves are not linear, right? They take more and more projected time to get to 6 mana than it does to 3, right? It's not... you will not always go from 1 to 6, right? You'll almost always go from 1 to 3 unless you're really stumbling. But it is very common to be sitting there for several turns on 3, 4, 5 mana and taking time to get your land drops, especially if you don't have a lot of extra card advantage. So 6 mana is substantially, monumentally more than like 4 mana, even though it's, it looks like 50% increase, but it's not. It's a, a substantial increase in the amount of time you expect to before the card will come online.
And before we move on to the next category, I wanted to mention that I recently wrote an article on power creep, and as I was kind of working through that article, one thing I landed on was these cards, these cheap snowbally threats, I think are largely responsible for a lot of the quote-unquote problems that people have with modern Magic, whereas everything is pushed, everything's low curve, everything gets started on turn 1. The removal has to be exceptionally good to keep up with it. The big 5 mana plus plays have to be absolutely insane because everything cheaper down on the curve is doing what they used to do. Like, I think cards like Adeline, Lelia, Ragavan, there's new ones that are ravaging Vintage Cube, like the Bombardiers and the Initiative cards. Like, those are all pushed so low on the curve that everything else has to be insane now too. So I do blame these types of cards for what I consider to be a lot of missteps in modern Magic, but that is something that can be addressed as like a whole problem down the line. I'll link to my article wherever you're listening to this if you want to read my thoughts on power creep in modern Magic.
Well, even some cards we do run, I think, for example, like I think if Subterranean Scooter was in any color but blue, it probably would not be in our cube. I think the fact that it is in the worst creature color and it's the hardest color to like get a creature decked off the ground is the thing that is keeping that card from being completely egregious.
So the next category, I had a different categorization for these, but the Mullslayers, I wanted to talk about those real quickly, and we don't have to talk about a bunch of them because a lot of them are just 5 mana green creatures that all fall into the same category, and I think Chris has talked about Vorinclex quite a bit on the podcast, but I wasn't sure where to classify Sheoldred the Apocalypse, but that feels like the type of card that we should mention in this episode. And it's not necessarily that it's a Mullslayer because it doesn't generate card advantage, but it did kind of fall in line with like those giant overstated creatures. Maybe this just belongs in the Overtuned category as well.
Must die to Doomblade.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it crosses into that sort of polarizing, must die to Doomblade swingy type cards. Because the thing about Sheoldred, and this is what we learned in Standard, is like if you don't have the answer immediately, right? Every turn that you need to that you're like digging with your draw step, you're still taking 2. They're gaining life, so like they're winning the race. They're adding to their board, and you have to still answer the Sheoldred or you're going to die to it. But also, if you use the most common way of digging for an answer, which is card draw, then even in other colors beyond blue, a lot of decks will have some amount of card draw in their deck. You're playing a Seasoned Pyromancer or a Smuggler's Copter or whatever it is. And Sheoldred just really punishes you for having to do that. And so it's very swingy in that, like, once you've untapped with it, it's super powerful. And also black decks are the decks that, like, the kind of black decks that Sheoldred is played in are the kind of decks that are looking to put the game state into, we're both top decking, but my top decks are Aquazot's Sheoldred and Misery Shadow, for example. And your top decks are, dorks or random card draw spells. So these black decks, like all the best black threats that are just raw stat threats, are exceptionally good when you've put the game into an attrition game state and both players have like 2 cards.
Yeah. Sheoldred also had the distinct problem of being one of those cards where if you saw it in a pack, you were just supposed to take it no matter what your strategy was. Like, it didn't matter if you wanted Rankle, and Rankle was like super synergistic for your deck or whatever. Sheoldred is just a better card every single time. So
yeah, that was a major issue. And just to touch back on something that I believe Teld illustrated earlier, which is like it's a 4/5 Death Touch for 4 that is going to grind the game out. Not only because it's draining your opponent out, but that it's also padding your life total. But the very thing that like you generally need to start doing when cards like that are on the battlefield, which is like start digging for an answer to it. It literally kills you for trying to dig towards an answer for it. Yeah, it's just a clusterfuck.
Big stats for no reason. Like, it's a big flashy card too. Like, it's a big character, so they kind of had to make a flashy card. But my least favorite trend in modern Magic is when cards that are just inherently good because of their abilities also just have like push stat lines. Like I like not everything. Shieldred, you could have made this like a 4/3 or something. I don't know. 4 or 5 is just egregious. But the card I wanted to mention for the like oops I win category is Palantir of Orthanc, because this is another one that I don't think is... We had trouble parsing out how this was going to play out. We talked about it in a review episode that never actually got released on the podcast. And then it kind of played out the way we thought it did. But did you guys want to talk about how Palantir kind of like warped games around it and why we ended up cutting the card?
I would put Palantir firmly in the polar category, which is not to say that it's not like just overtuned or whatever. Palantir is a 3-cost colorless artifact. At the beginning of your end step, you put so much text. At the beginning of your end step, you put an influence counter on it and scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on Palantir, and then that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. So to just try to stitch this all neatly up in a passage, at the end of your end step, you scry 2, and then your opponent gets to decide whether or not you draw your top card. And if they don't, you mill progressively more cards for the amount of time this has been on the battlefield, and then they eat whatever amount of damage the total converted mana cost is.
Yes.
This is a powerful card, but one of the biggest problems with it is how polar it is, because you could play this on 3 against an aggressive deck, and don't get me wrong, the like scry 2 draw a card thing is fine on every end step or whatever, but you know, if you're on the play and your opponent's gone like 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and then you go Palantir, you know, they're going to throw themselves a little party because you didn't do anything. They have 3 pieces of cardboard that are probably generating value while killing you on the battlefield, and you did effectively nothing. And if they're far enough ahead of you, they don't ever have to let you draw a card because they don't really give a shit about taking damage of their own. Whereas if you were to resolve this against a control deck that's not pressuring your life total at all, at a certain point, they just have to let you start drawing cards or this will kill them while it's out carding them. Basically, like in situations where you're not being pressured at all by a slower deck, this is just like a time bomb that will eventually kill them. And against highly proactive decks that are beating the shit out of you and demanding your lunch money, this does not protect you at all.
No, but this card was also really good against proactive decks. Like if you were playing a red aggressive deck or like a white aggressive deck, and you like played this on, you usually didn't want to play on 3, but if you played on like 4 or something, a lot of times this card will like just win the race on its own. If like you're in a close racing, you're just like it just mills and you just like take a bunch of damage. And there's also the hilarious things in like more powerful contexts where you like you put it in your green deck and you mill like a a 7-drop, or you mill an Ulamog and your opponent gets domed for 11 out of nowhere.
I have seen a literal dome for 12 off of this card.
One thing I just don't like about this card, and it's not like falling into any of these categories, is it gives your opponent player agency in a way that like doesn't matter, because there's almost always a correct thing to do with the card. Like we noticed the play pattern like on a blank slate is almost always mill again, let your opponent start drawing cards. Like, yeah, that's just how it plays out every single time, unless like life totals are such that you have to do one or the other. So like it gives your opponent a choice, but their choice is like the correct choice is almost always obvious. So like it only gives your opponent the choice to mess up, which is not really a fun choice for your opponent to be making anyway. It does have that polarity to it. It's got that problem. Sometimes this is a card that comes out on turn 3 and you just know that you're going to lose to it because you don't have the pressure to race it. You can't beat 2 cards a turn.
Yeah.
You know,
that's
the game is over.
Thing too is like if you don't have that turn, you mentioned throwing a party, but like if you don't have enough pressure on that turn, you get like one more turn, but your opponent gets to play to the board on that turn. After that, your opponent's just getting a bunch of resources. And like scry 2, draw 1, they're preordaining every turn at that point. I mean, it is very, very good card advantage because they're not missing.
That's really true. I just do think I wasn't trying to make the case that it's like completely fucking awful outside of the circumstances that I outlined. It's just like it Jordan-style dunks on control decks.
Yeah, I just wanted to put some context to what you were saying because it is true that the turn you play it, you're a little soft, but it's the sort of like looming threat in the background of like if this game goes more than another turn, you're probably going to lose to it.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with the idea that, like, in a board state where you're not, like, under immediate I'm gonna die pressure, this is still, like, a pretty good play, even though it doesn't affect the board, quote-unquote. Mm-hmm. And then I just wanted to highlight something that Tim mentioned earlier, which is one of our categories is, like, uninteractability, That's not like a problem, I guess, if you're playing it in cubes that are designed in such a way that having a shitload of naturalizes running around is like something that's part of your design or like fits well with what your cube is doing. But it doesn't fit ours particularly well. In the arena cube, we have this like weird, or in the arena card pool, we have this weird issue where artifacts are either like just completely unplayable or completely absurd, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of in between. So, like, in those kind of situations in that card pool, like, there are going to be some cards like Great Henge and stuff like that that are just awesome, fun, powerful cards that you want to play with because they're artifacts. But there aren't enough of those that, like, putting Rex Sage in your cube is necessarily, like, a good idea, right? So there's always this dance that you're doing, which is, like, Great Henge is, like, expensive and, like, requires some work and some deck building to do. Palantir always costs 3. And the uninteractability exacerbates how punishing it is against control decks. Because if this was like a 2/2 creature that did this, then, you know, your control deck could just like cut down it or whatever. But unless you're like literally in our cube, unless you're like literally packing Kolagon's command, like you're not cleaning this up.
Yeah, one last thing about Palantir is the sort of way that it completely changes the way you're allowed to play the game. And what I mean by that is that you're playing Palantir, you got it in your hand. You can actually set yourself up where I'm going to just aggressively trade with everything you've got because this Palantir is going to bury you regardless of what I do. And I'm going to set myself up to not race you. And instead I'm going to leverage the card advantage that you can't beat and trade off all my cards. And you can't always do that, but it does let you get into that game state sometimes where you open with Palantir and you set yourself up to win with the Palantir because the card makes the whole game revolve around it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not quite as bad as the next category, which is the uninteractable cards, but having like very niche answers to a card is close to uninteractable for some decks. So, you know, artifacts and enchantments are always going to fall in that line. Bitter Blossom, Palantir, very similar. So, do you guys have a favorite or maybe a least favorite uninteractable card? A lot of these have never even touched the cube for what it's worth.
Field, no contest. Well, maybe a contest because Clothis is up there too, but
I do love me a Clothis.
So Field of the Dead, we did play this one, and we found it to be a card that showed up way more often than we thought it would.
Okay, so I'm sure most people are familiar with Field of the Dead, but Field of the Dead is a colorless land that ETB's tapped. And whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you can control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So let's be clear up front, like if you're not playing a decent amount of fixing, then this is actually pretty difficult to enable. However, what you're going to run to pretty quickly is, I think we generally think it's good to run a high density of fixing in your cubes, not just because it like creates the possibility of playing true multicolor. Like that's not actually why I would advocate for playing a lot of dual lands in your cube. Honestly, it's so like your 2 and 3 color decks can like function at maximum efficiency, right? Like I don't think including more fixing necessarily advantages multicolor decks. I think that entirely boils down to like what cards you choose to play, right? The issue with Field was when we first started the cube, at a 360, we were playing 3 duels of each color. Now we're up to 4, and we have all 10 of the triomes, not to mention other fixers.
And fetch lands.
Now we have 5 of the fetches. We're going to get the other fetch lands. So Field of the Dead, once upon a time, was like a card where you had to be kind of aggressively multicolor, which has costs in draft, yada, yada, yada. Even then, I thought the card sucked because once it gets online, like, what are you ever supposed to do at that point? Like, again, you probably shouldn't be running a lot of Stone Rains in your cube unless you have like some specific design goal stuff going on. When we decided to ban Field of the Dead was the day that we saw someone include it as a win condition in a 3-0 Grixis control list that was literally not playing a single non-Grixis land. The density of fixing for the 3-color deck to work was just high enough to make Field of the Dead like, I'm playing a control deck, I'm removing your stuff, I'm playing control finishers, I'm playing a good control deck, and oh, by the way, one of my lands just happens to shit out zombies in a way that you can't shut down. Mm-hmm. So, Field of the Dead, it's gimmicky, It's difficult to interact with. If you can't kill your opponent before they get it online, like, it's very difficult to beat. I fucking hate this card.
And we had Golos.
Which we still do. But Golos, yeah, and on top of that, like, in basically any cube, I think we're going to see Field of the Dead. You're probably going to see Golos, too.
Primeval Titan.
Primetime gets it if you're doing this type of thing, too.
Well, Primetime's broken for a lot of different reasons. Let's not get into Primetime here, guys.
Colossal Dreadmaw.
I think the kicker for me, I think I saw Field of the Dead showed up in like a 3-color aggressive Mardu deck once, and it was like I have so much fix-in because I'm a Mardu deck, I can just kind of slot Field of the Dead in here as like a backup win condition in case the game goes longer than I need it to, and it was like, oh, that deck just won too. So it was like, okay, you can just put Field of the Dead in any deck as like a backup for like a pretty low opportunity cost too.
Yeah, and now that we have the fetches, you can like play a fetch and trigger it, and then go fetch something with a different name and trigger it again. It's just, come on.
So I've actually got 2 cards. I'm going to spend one that I just want to briefly shout out, which is Clothis. It's secretly a black card, right? It graveyard hates and then drains 2. Like, isn't that just a black card? It's literally, there's a common out of Crimson Vow that does the same thing, except it only does it once.
But it makes red or green mana.
Oh, yeah, so it makes red or green mana, sure. Yeah, that card is very, very silly. It's a low-key, like, reason to play green in your control deck. You just, like, put it on the battlefield, and it drains 2 every turn, which is, like, actually really, really hard to race. The card I really wanted to talk about was the One Ring, and it's a card that we don't play. But I want to specify that I don't actually think the card was an issue. And I think that you guys probably agree that it wasn't actually a problematic card. It was just one that everybody really, really hated having around. And it was kind of tearing up Constructed. And so people were like, you know, why are we running this card and that sort of thing. And I actually think it was kind of mid. I don't actually think it was, it had like a really high ceiling, but I actually think that a lot of times the burden counters or whatever just killed you. I also got to do the sweet thing of the questing beast. One of the 17 lines of text on that card is that it doesn't care about protection. But anyways, I just wanted to mention that card as one that we're not playing, but I don't actually think it's because it's too good per se. I mean, it is really powerful, but again, most of the decks people are playing and it just, oops, they died to their burden counters.
Yeah, I mean, that can definitely happen, but like it drives me fucking crazy that this card has the line protection from everything on it. It's just like, get the fuck out of here with that. Protect yourself from this. Like, I hate this card.
Oh, sure, I don't like it. Yeah, I don't like it either.
Well, what I did want to backtrack really quickly on Clothis and just mention the fact that, like, Clothis is difficult to interact with because it's an enchantment, like we've already mentioned, like Bitter Blossom in cards. But hilariously, it's not just an enchantment, it's an indestructible enchantment.
Break out your Fade to Antiquities, boys.
Yeah, really. Like, unless you can exile an enchantment, which is not a line of text you see on a ton of cards, you can't get rid of this. And then even if you satisfy the conditions for it to become a creature, at which point it's a fucking 4/5, it's indestructible. So, like, it's not even like when it realizes the upside of being a sulfuric vortex that drains and creates mana and is also a 4/5 at the same time. Like, you can't even Doomblade it.
Here's the thing. My Timeless Control deck literally could not animate Clothis, and it was still one of the best cards in my deck.
Oh, yeah. I mean, sulfuric vortex that doesn't hurt you at all. In fact, it gains you life. It's just, like, insane on its own.
The funny thing about Clothis, too, is, like, a lot of times you do everything in your power not to have it become a creature, even if you could, so that it's not vulnerable to, like, a Swords to Plowshares or something like that.
Right.
Like, you don't want it to become a god, like a creature most of the time, because it's just, what is your opponent going to do about this enchantment otherwise? Like, you give that, animating it gives them outs to the card.
I'm just sitting here imagining Clothis be like, no, don't worship me! Don't worship me!
No. Strike down the believers.
Death by Clothis is, like, so inevitable, you don't even want the upside to happen.
These the cards operate on a different axis, so these are the cards that Teld called the vintage cards. I wanted to personally mention Lutri, the Spell Shaper. Is that the name of the card?
I believe it's spelled Chaser, right? Because you cast a spell and then he chases it and copies it.
Yeah, Lutri, the Companion Otter.
Short of it is, Lutri's broken. It's super busted. It goes into every deck.
Well, I don't, Chris, do you remember how Lutri made it into the Unrestricted Cube?
I don't.
So, Izzet was underperforming by a lot. Like, this was back when we were tracking data, and Izzet was, like, one of the last place decks to the point where we're like, okay, what can we do to bolster is it? And we're like, give it a companion. So we put Lutri in, and then like the very first time some Golgari drafter just companioned Lutri for free. Like, I don't know that they could even cast Lutri, but they had at least 1 or 2 cards in their deck that could take advantage of having an extra piece of cardboard. I think we played Pack Rat at the time too. So like they could pick up Lutri and pitch it to Pack Rat or something like that. And it was just, the card is not a broken Magic the Gathering card in the sense that like when you cast it and resolve its ability, it just wins the game every time. It's broken in the sense that it gives you a free companion in singleton environments at 0 opportunity cost, and other people don't have that. So you just have 8 cards in your hand at the start of the game, whereas at least with Luris or Yorion, which are other companions that we run or have run in the past, like you have to do something for those cards, and the payoff is like very much worth it with Luris, and sorry guys, not worth it with Yorion. But like Lutri, you just take it no matter what your deck is. It turns out it did not bolster Izzet's win percentage. It bolstered whatever the win percentage of the deck that got to companion Lutri for free is. So that's just doing a different thing than every other deck in the format.
It's really easy to get like a Bitter Triumph or a Faithless Looting or a Lae'zel if you're playing in the Timeless Cube, and just like it almost doesn't matter if you've got 1 or 2 ways of taking advantage of having an 8th card in hand for 3 mana. You know, these decks just, it comes up. And then like if you actually can cast it, you get stuff on top of that. Like you can copy Swords to Plowshares, you can copy Lightning Bolts, and you can copy, if you want to get really ambitious, you can copy Time Warp.
Yeah, it is actually just good when you cast it too. Like it's not broken, but it is very good when you cast it.
Yeah.
I think that was post companion nerf. But you can imagine Lutri in a world where, like, you didn't have to pay for the companion cost, which was an insane time.
Lutri might be one of the only companion, or one of the companions specifically, that got better with the companion nerf in a way. Not literally better, because, like, obviously not paying 3 is better than paying 3. But the fact that you can add Lutri to your hand is a relevant line of text on a bunch of decks that can't even cast it, like you mentioned.
I think people getting their spells targeted by Mana Leak would argue against the sentiment that not paying 3 is better than paying 3, but I get your point. I wanted to ask you guys about one real quick that we should probably highlight here, which is Utopia Sprawl, which feels like a weird outlier in this category with cards like Channel, Natural Order, and Demonic Tutor. People have pegged Delighted Halfling as the best 1-mana accelerant on Arena, and I think it's squarely Utopia Sprawl. Can you talk about like why Utopia Sprawl?
It's definitely Utopia Sprawl.
It's not a contest. Like, it's not even close.
It's not.
I don't know why you would. Yeah, no, I don't know why you would make the claim that Delighted Halfling is the best one. Like, I'm just gonna say that I don't actually think the Utopia Sprawl, like in my mind, fits into the operating on a different axis category the way that like Channel does or Lutri does. Utopia Sprawl is busted because it's uninteractable, because it's an enchantment, and it's overtuned. You can't bolt a bird. You literally can't. And then on any turn past turn 1, it's literally Birds of Paradise that you can't bolt that also has haste.
Yep. The Birds of Paradise with haste and hexproof basically sums it up.
Yeah, Birds of Paradise with haste would be nuts, and this is Birds of Paradise with haste and hexproof. Because, like, God knows that 0/1 body doesn't matter outside of, like, some scenario you can concoct revolving around Craterhoof Behemoth or something. You could make the argument, I guess, that, you know, Utopia Sprawl, if you get, like, Stone Rained, is rough or whatever, but, like, A, is it really later on in the game, and B, like, don't play Stone Rain. So I would say that Utopia Sprawl is a combination of uninteractable and wildly overtuned.
Yeah, something to mention here, I'm glad you brought that up, because I meant to mention it with Field of the Dead, too, is, like, if you recognize a card like Utopia Sprawl or Field of the Dead is an issue, one solution, and it's not a good one, but one solution would be to introduce cards into your cube that answer that type of permanent. So, like, for example, if we really wanted to do that, we could play like a Spread and Seize, or we could play like one of the colorless Demolition Field, Field of Ruin types things. But that's where cube equity comes in. You're then just you're sculpting space out of your cube that could be used for other things, for like very niche sideboard cards. And instead of doing that, you could just cut the problematic card. Like, you don't have to play with problematic cards. I think there are some cube designers who don't quite grasp the idea that if a card is like uninteractable and wins all the time, that you don't actually have to play with that card. But
yeah, you know what makes Field of the Dead even cooler? When it eats up 10 slots of cube equity for cards that like you don't even want to main board, and even when field comes down, you might not even draw them even after you sideboarded them in.
The 2023 Jank Diver arc has been, what if we just cut the overpowered cards or the messed up cards instead of playing around them?
Yeah, and people get to play fun games instead of games decided by singular cards, which is a story for a lot of these. The last category, we've already talked about Fable, we've talked about Orcish Bowmasters a little bit. We do have, I think it's appropriate Chris makes the announcement here for our newest banning, but the Overturned Cards, right? The Overturned Cards here, which I'm not sure if you consider the card we're removing here an Overturned card necessarily, but it has been putting up insane results in our cube.
I literally have said at multiple points that we would cut this card over my dead body, but I'm finally ready to let it go. We're cutting Yawgmoth Thran Physician from the cube. This is the 4-mana 2/4 protection from humans for some reason. It has proliferate text on it that you don't see come up that often, but basically what it does is at instant speed it can sacrifice any other creature to put a -1/-1 counter on something and draw a card. The black sacrifice deck is extremely, extremely well supported in our cube because, frankly, like that's what most of the highest quality black cards outside of like removal and sort of generic stompers in the arena card pool do. And that deck has been overperforming for a long time. And Yogg is a card in that deck that if it comes down and your board state exists in the way that your design was intended, it just like kills 2 things and like draws 4 cards immediately, and then it's also a 2/4 blocker. The question has kind of become, do we nerf the components of what makes the deck function, or do we remove the card in the deck that is like your best draw pretty much every single time? And based on what Tim just said, do we make a bunch of design choices around a card so we can continue to play it, or do we just not play the card? I think we've just landed on not playing the card. The other thing about Yawgmoth is that against control decks, it's not actually that great, because if there's nothing to put -1/-1 counters on, then what you're essentially doing is you're sacrificing creatures to draw cards, which you're just going to kind of draw more creatures to play. So it kind of creates this loop where like, yeah, you're drawing cards, but you're kind of drawing more cards that do the same thing that the cards that you're sacrificing or that you're drawing. I've kind of lost the thread here, but you take my point, right? Like against a control deck, you don't want to be sacrificing on board 2/1s so you can draw more 2/1s, right? You just want to beat your opponent to death with the 2/1s that you have. Whereas against like an opposing aggressive deck, it's just like, okay, I have Ophiomancer and Yawgmoth, like cool X1 nerds. So yeah, the card's pretty out of control. I am sad to see the card go in a lot of ways, but one thing that I will not miss about it is like protection from humans is just such a stupid line of text that has like nothing to do with the actual functionality of the card. It just comes up occasionally in ways that are obnoxious. And actually one thing, Teld, that you mentioned about this recently that was like kind of one of the first steps towards us considering doing this was once upon a time for Yawgmoth to be a great card in your deck, you had to play a bunch of like pretty shitty cards in your deck that enabled it, right? Like your Gutter Bones and your Nested Shamblers and your cards that are like whatever cheap creatures that really only have substantial value in decks that can do Yawgmoth things. But like now all of the black cards that support sacrifice just also happen to be good. So like you don't even really have to sacrifice raw card quality very much to make Yawgmoth good. So
yeah, and like in addition, the white tokensy decks have gotten a lot more support, which makes the amount of like sheer fodder you can generate, especially in that color combination, a lot higher. I think in general this was like the way to sum this up too is like we knew something needed to go in the black deck, so we decided to ban the card that has one of the best decks in Modern named after it. That's probably a good if you're like one of the best decks in Modern and your deck's name is just Yawgmoth, that's probably a good signal that this card is not reasonable.
Yeah, and Meathook is an issue too in the same deck because like Meathook has a little bit of that like oops I win the game kind of quality to it, but ultimately I think Yawgmoth needed to be the cut because your blue-black control deck can pick up a Meathook and make very, very good use of it, whereas like Yawgmoth does one thing and it does it so brutally efficiently that it pushes the deck it's in over the top and doesn't really offer any other decks any value.
Well, Yawgmoth, I think the breaking point for me was that it was just showing up in like every other black 3-0 deck, and black has been winning a lot, so it shows up a lot. So
yeah, Miuk shows up a little less because people put it in bad decks, but the Yogg decks, because Yogg is so good, just end up being good decks.
It does make bad decks better.
Well, the final drop of blood for the blood god is himself in this case. So bye-bye, Yogg.
That it is. Father of Machines, R.I.P. Let's talk real quick about some watchlist cards. So you mentioned Meat Hook Massacre already, and by watchlist I mean cards that kind of fit some of the criteria that we've talked about here, some of the categories of reasons we ban cards, but they're actually cards that are in the cube. Meat Hook Massacre, you said it falls into that like oops I win category, and it does, but it's a very flexible card, and black sweepers on Arena are kind of weak.
That's euphemism. That's a euphemism. Kind of weak.
Yeah. I mean, we're playing Languish and Devious Cover Up, and neither of those are like excellent sweepers. So Meat Hook Massacres kind of fill in the role of like our best black sweeper, while also being a card that goes in a lot of different decks. So that one was in the conversation about possible ban-in. One of our players recently called it what they consider to be the best card in the entire cube. I think that's maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but not that far off. And I think we're going to hold on to Meat Hook Massacre for now, especially banning
too fun.
Yawgmoth.
Like, meat hooking your own board with blood artists on it to win the game is just, I'm sorry. Like, that's just too fun. Like, it's too fun. Like, even when it happens to me, I'm like, that's fun.
It is a cool card.
Yeah, like, the issue, I guess, is just how it happens out of nowhere, and, like, it's hard to respond to in some ways. Like, you know, I guess the same thing if you had a Woe Strider or something, but Miuk just gets you more triggers, right? Because it's making its own triggers. You're getting all those Blood Artist triggers at the same time. So I get the sentiment about meat hooking for like 2 being just an exceptionally powerful way to win the game. And if the kind of black decks that have been winning keep winning at the same rate, meat hook would probably be the next card to go. I think it's the next best piece in those decks.
Yeah, I think it's Thoughtseize. I think it's time for Thoughtseize to go. They think I'm joking. Like, I keep saying this.
No, I know you're not joking. That's why I'm laughing, is because I know you're not joking.
Get it out of here. 2 red aggressive creatures that are kind of fit in the bill of some of these like snowball-y type things we've talked about. Inti, Seneskull of the Sun, and Breaches. Honestly, Breaches is here because Chris had a vendetta against a Redditor. But Inti is, I think, in that power category. I think Inti's very similar to a card like Adeline or Lelia, where it plays out very similarly. But I think we've also noticed that red aggressive decks are like slightly, just like ever so slightly below the bar right now, that we're willing to let them play with some of the more powerful red options we have available that we've gotten in the last couple sets, to the point where like it kind of balances out where red's out right now. So if red suddenly got something in the next set and it started winning week after week after week, I think Inti would be the card that I would look at if it was showing up in those winning decks, because it is just a very hyper powerful snowball-y threat.
Yeah, Breaches so far, every time I've seen it, has immediately eaten a Doomblade, but that also was something we mentioned, right? That if you have to immediately kill it because of the way it works. So it doesn't surprise me that pretty much, when you play it, it dies to removal because your opponent is going to lose to it otherwise. The one game I saw it that it didn't, it took over the game shockingly, and made a treasure, drew a card, and then faltered your opponent for 3 turns or something, or 2 turns, killed them.
Yeah, I mean, Adeline dies to Doomblade a lot too, right?
Yeah.
But that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's like, it literally has to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think Inti of the 2 is probably more powerful, simply because 2 mana is less than 3 mana, and Inti just comes down earlier, does a better thing. I was a little surprised by that, like, just thinking about it, but though that's the way it's played out, Inti's being so cheap has just been a really big deal.
Well, it gets big. It gets big while it draws cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gives trample. It's a lot like a Luminarch Aspirant that also just like makes your hand work, and it just randomly combos with, like, if you discard to any other effect, you get this ability as well. I was playing it wasn't our cube, it was someone else's cube, I think one of Aaron's cubes, and I had my opponent had Inti on board, and I had Inquisition of Kozilek in my hand, and I, like, you can't cast that because your opponent will you'll discard a spell, but they just get another card off the top. It's like, what?
Sure, Faithless Looting, like, puts you up +2 instead of down cards.
Yeah. Inti's a very powerful card that I could see getting cut at some point, but for right now, it is behaving itself, at least in the context of how red is behaving itself. I do think we're all in agreement that once we get another mana dork, we're probably cutting Delighted Halfling for just how egregious that anti-counter text on it is.
The polarity of it, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, like one of the most polarizing cards out there, where it has a line of text that means absolutely nothing against 80% of the field, but then just completely hoses a small subset of cards in a way that matters, like,
yeah,
exponentially.
You may notice that most of the polar cards that they're printing these days are like almost explicitly anti-blue hate pieces that don't need to exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because blue has to suck.
Yeah.
Where are we at on Smuggler's Copter? Like, this is a card that we added kind of recognizing that we would probably just end up cutting it some number of months down the line. We did just get it, so maybe it's still in the works, but do we have, has Smuggler's Copter been tearing up the Unrestricted Cube queues?
When I've seen it, it looked incredibly powerful.
Like, no one's complained about it yet, but, like, we were fully aware when we added it. It's like one of those cards where it's like, they gave us Smuggler's Copter, finally, like, we gotta play with it, you know? But I think Copter probably falls into that sort of category of cards I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Palantir, where, like, colorless artifacts that they give us on Arena are either stupid powerful or completely janky. And Smuggler's Copter is definitely stupid powerful. One of the reasons that, like, I'm not as concerned about Copter is it has felt like the meta has shifted a lot from, say, a year and a half ago to where it feels like there's a large enough amount of cheap removal and overstated creatures for their cost that, like, aggro is not dunking anymore. And I think Copter is a nice tool for that, but who knows? We'll just have to watch it. I mean, it's probably too good. Too long, didn't read. Probably too good.
Yeah, we'll see. Teld, you've got a couple of cards on here you wanted to mention for the watch list.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of blue cards. So, Cyber Siphoner is an alchemy card. Obviously, as soon as we get an opportunity to remove it and not hurt Blue's power level, it's going. It's a silly card, enables like one of the handful of infinite combos available in the cube, even if that has never really shown itself to be problematic. I don't like that it exists. It's just most of the time better Snapcaster Mage. So yeah, that card, like, once we have a reasonable replacement, we'll probably go. But the other one is Chromo Sea Shark, which I think is probably the best single card in the cube if you're just like in a vacuum. I think that card is completely ridiculous. And blue cards get a pass on power level, but I'm not saying Sea Shark is problematic, but that's partly due to blue's power. Again, I think if this card was in another color and did like something similar, it would just be too good. Sea Shark is an amazing blocker. It's a decent attacker. It gums up the ground, eventually overwhelms your opponent with cardboard, combos with Time Warp and all the other best blue cards. So just a really, really silly, messed up card. And then finally I had Aclazotz, which is one of the most broken limited cards in recent memory. It pushed over a 70% win rate in LCI, and like, it hasn't seemed particularly problematic yet in our environment, but also I've heard a number of aggressive drafters say basically it resolved, they died. And I've also watched it completely dominate a game where, you know, it was like a grindier matchup and you just could not kill it if you didn't have Swords to Plowshares, essentially. There's just not a ton of ways. There are ways, but there's just not a ton of ways that effectively deal with this card, and it just keeps coming back and keeps grinding out the game, and very, very hard to deal with both for aggressive decks and grindy decks, which puts it on my radar as like a card to watch. But I don't think it's currently in that spot of like immediate remove, because the decks that it goes well in haven't been like necessarily dominating, though they've been quite good.
It has the hallmarks of potentially problematic, but hasn't bared out to actually be problematic, I don't think.
Right.
I wanted to mention real quick 2 cards, Nissa Who Shakes the World and Swords to Plowshares, which I think are power outliers in the sense that like these cards are just way better than a lot of what the rest of the cube is doing and fall into a lot of the categories we talked about, but they have this kind of like classicness to them. We talked about Nissa, I think, on a previous episode as well. I think on the Polarity episode, we talked about why Nissa Who Shakes the World gets a pass. And part of the reason is that like there's almost an expectation for people to play it, and people enjoy playing it, and people don't complain about it too much. Swords to Plowshares is very similar, where it's just the single best removal spell in the entire cube, and probably will continue to be moving forward. But do you guys agree with the sentiment that like answers are usually more palatable than like threats when it comes to a lot of the stuff we're talking about? Like, how many removal spells did we talk about today? None?
It's one of those things where, like, there are definitely moments where, like, Swords to Plowshares won the game, but it's not it won the game in the sense that it's like I played something that's like literally impossible to deal with, and you lost to it because it's impossible to deal with. It's the type of card that wins games because it's so wildly tempo efficient, which is an axis that I'm fine with. You know, like you'll hear people say like, fuck, like Wormcoil Engine came down against my aggressive deck and there was literally nothing I could do. You don't really hear the complaint like, oh man, the game was fine until, you know, they cast Swords to Plowshares. Like, in some cases, if you analyze what happened, that is literally what happened. Like, Swords won the game, but it just feels different with answers.
Yeah, you also have to ask yourself, like, how many of those games that Swords to Plowshares won would you have still won if you just, like, untapped and played a Doomblade? I know there's obviously that's non-zero, but, like, how often is it just a removal spell won the game as opposed to it being specifically Swords?
Yeah, Swords is the best removal spell, but the delta between Swords and the next batch of removal spells, like Bolt, Fatal Push, whatever you want to put in that category, is like a lot thinner of a delta than the delta between Wormcoil Engine and whatever the next 6-drop you could have cast is, or something like that. So
I know not everybody agrees with this take, but like, I will bend my mana to play Esika's Chariot. I will bend my mana to play Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I'm not going to go out of my way to add a third color of mana to my deck to squeeze in like a single copy of a removal spell. And I don't think Teld necessarily agrees with me on that one in particular, but like, I'm not going to draft a 3-color mana base so I can play Gruul plus Swords to Plowshares. I will force a 3-color mana base to play like Boros tokens with Esika's Chariot in it.
Sure, I actually kind of agree with you in the sense that I'm a lot more willing to greedy splash for threats than answers. So, like, for example, if I was playing a blue-red deck, I would, if I had, like, 3 white sources, I would probably jam Quintorius into my deck. But it would take, like, 5 or 6 white sources before I would want to put a Swords to Plowshares in my deck, right? Because, like, I just recognize that part of it's like the mana cost, right? Like a 5-mana card, I can give some time to draw, but part of it is just the game impact that I think a card like Quintorius is going to have on the game is just on average a lot higher than whatever that Swords is compared to like the removal spell that I would have ran instead of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll play a Mountain and Evolving Wilds and a Royal Eruption and call it a day, so I'm going to have to disagree with you guys here. You had some questions about power levels you wanted to ask real quick before we wrap up?
Just kind of like some thoughts. Like when people ask us, you know, okay, well, if your guys are cutting for power level reasons, what is our ceiling right now as to the cards that are like up there at the peak of power, but never in risk of getting cut? So some examples that I thought of were stuff like the Wandering Emperor, Wedding Announcement, Chandra Torch of Defiance. These were some examples of like the top end of power that is at no risk of getting cut because they're still fundamentally fair cards.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a line to cross, and it's hard to say exactly what the line is. And we've mentioned before that there's a certain point where, I mean, there's like, we didn't talk about every single card, but there's something like 50 cards on the quote-unquote ban list or something like that, and it's like, well, at what point do you just allow all those cards to be in the environment and just say that the ceiling's a little bit higher than it used to be? That only works if the floor is also catching up to the ceiling, which it is not. So there's a certain point where what are we going to do? Cut Chandra Torch of Defiance, and then like whatever the next best red card is just going to take the spot, and what are we going to do? Cut that card? It's kind of like when you cut cards in Standard because they win at like a 57% win rate or something like that. It's like, okay, you cut that card and now something else is the best card. So at a certain point we have to recognize that some cards are just generically better than a lot of the other cards in the color, especially if they're fun. Like you talked about Meat Hook Massacre is a fun card. It's fun to say Meat Hook Massacre. It looks cool. It's an awesome card. People like playing with it. Nissa Who Shakes the World is clearly better, in my opinion, than pretty much like every other green card in the cube. In fact, a lot of other cards in all the colors, but we're okay with it. Like some consideration comes down to the fact that like you can't have a completely flat cube. Like in a cube of all 8s, you're probably going to have a 9. You're probably going to have a 6. Like if you had nothing but 8s, all the decks would just bounce their cards off of each other. So
right.
We've got a couple things that fall into that category is what I'm trying to say.
The Lucky Paper guys on some episode that they did sort of summarize this in a way that I liked. Like having a completely flat power level effectively means that like there are no exciting first picks. Like there literally cannot be anything as a completely flat power level, but like some power outliers, as long as they're not like completely unacceptably egregious, in the early picks of a draft will draw you into colors and kind of shape the way that you draft from that point forward. Or you like open your first pack and you're like, yeah, Wandering Emperor, that's fucking sick. You know, like having cards like that I think is good for the draft, as long as it's not like, and I've brought up this example before, like you might not want to like put Nissa Who Shakes the World into like your peasant cube.
Yeah.
So when somebody opens it, they're like, oh, Nissa Who Shakes the World, that's great. Like that's really not where you want to be, you know, but like having some amount of acceptable power outliers to make some like picks more exciting is like probably a good thing. The other thing that I wanted to mention about like something like Wandering Emperor is like, yeah, Wandering Emperor is a really, really powerful card. And it's, in some cases, like it comes down and you're just like, oh, well, I lose now. But it's in a way that's sort of like interactive and interesting. Mm-hmm. It's not a power outlier like Worm Coil Engine. Like you can be behind enough that Wandering Emperor is not going to dig you out of that hole, right? You can be in board states where like Wandering Emperor is still like a good play, like, or Chandra, for example. Like Chandra is really powerful and it can be game defining, but like if I'm ahead of you and I'm playing an aggro deck and like the play that you have to make is that you play your Chandra and like minus it on my best creature, which is like maybe a 3-drop, and I still have some like smaller creatures littering the board, like, I mean, it interacted, but it didn't just like dominate the game like something like a Bonehorde Dracosaur would have, where it like comes down and it's like, okay, now you literally can't attack, and I'm going to beat you to death, and I'm going to draw cards for free. So it's a question of feeling. I think power outliers are acceptable as long as they're not cards that every single time they resolve, they suddenly redefine the entire way that the game works. Did that make any sense?
It does, though. I want to specify what I was kind of getting at with my question are cards that like are markers of cards that represent power that we're okay adding more of. So these are just like what I was thinking, I guess, are like cards that are bread and butter great picks, right? They're bread and butter great picks, but they're never at threat of being removed, right? Of being removed from the cube on like being too good. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what I was getting at. And these are the exciting first picks, right? These are your Torrential Gear Hulks or Sublime Epiphanies. These are your Chandras, your Wedding Announcements, your Wandering Emperors. These are all cards that are like really exciting to open. They get you thinking about a deck, but they don't represent something that is on the watch list, for example, like an Inti or whatever. I do think also that the whole question around the power ceiling thing of like, why don't you just play these cards if you have such a long list, is like simply that you have a design for the kind of magic you're looking for, and adding all those cards back in would either be less interactive or faster than you want or whatever, and we have a design goal. So I think that would be the fundamental of it. And then the other question I had is like about the peak of snowballing. So for example, the one I brought up a couple of times was Luminarch Aspirant. It's a great card, premium 2-drop, snowbally, but like I don't think I've ever heard anyone just be like, man, Luminarch Aspirant is a busted card and we should cut it. You know, it's like that. It feels like that's like kind of the range of like, that's an acceptable amount of snowballiness for a 2-mana card. It's good, it's really good, but it's not like drawing people's ire. So like what these are the kind of just examples of like snowbally cards that we think are good and or fair or whatever.
I mean, it comes down to like what they represent overall in the game, right? Luminarch Aspirant is 2 mana, and the turn it comes down, it's 2 mana for 2 power and 2 toughness, which is like totally acceptable. It survives a turn, you might get 3 power and 3 toughness. If it survives beyond that, like your opponent is clearly either fumbling or dealing with other threats, in which case Luminarch Aspirant. Like I think it's acceptable. It's very similar to Kyrion Beastcaller in the sense that like, yeah, that card represents a lot of power and toughness as long as your opponent's doing stuff, but it's interactable. Right. It's not coming down. A lot of it is like, how much value do you get the turn these cards come down? When we talked about snowbally threats, we included Adeline and Lelia, which like just put you up on board immediately, like actual card advantage in some sense, whereas like cards that just are adding, small amounts of power, Ranger class, basically all the cards that are like every turn you get a +1/+1 counter, we have a lot of cards in that category actually. Sharp-Eyed Rookie it falls into that category as well. Like I think these are usually fine.
Yeah, and in some cases stuff like these cards require some amount of like setup or follow up, or in like Kyrion Beastcaller's case, both, right? Because like Kyrion Beastcaller, if you just play it and it dies, obviously it does nothing. But also if you play it and you cast another creature and then your opponent decides to kill it, it still does nothing. You need to have like things on the board and get counters on it. And then afterwards, that's the only way you get that extra little bit of value out of it. And Luminarch Aspirin, if you don't open up with a 1-drop, is just, like you said, it's a bear, right? And you get a full turn to kill it before it does anything. And your opponent still has to have another card before they start getting to spread out the power. So a lot of these cards, it does feel like they have some like setup involved too, which Sharp-Eyed Rookie needs you to have like a card that can pump it, to follow it up. So there's some setup involved that something like an Escus Chariot doesn't. It just kind of does the thing, and like you're up a bunch of resources just for free.
One last note that I'll make, just kind of touching back on something Teld said a minute ago about design goals, is like, you could arrive at a point, right, where we just have so many ridiculously powerful cards that none of them are like massive power outliers relative to each other. However, if every single one of those cards is like a massive swing, and you include all those cards, then what you've created is a cube environment where like every time somebody resolves anything, the entire dynamic of the board state changes.
Chromatic cube style gameplay.
Right, and it's like, okay, like none of these cards might be inherently more powerful than one another, but by playing all of these cards that have like a massive outsized impact the turn that you play them, regardless of what's going on the board state, then it's literally like a boxing match where no one can block. It's just like, I'm going to hit you as hard as I can. I'm going to hit you as hard as I can. I'm going to hit you as hard as I can. Who drops first? And like, if that's what boxing was, no one but the very, very stupid would want to watch it. So.
Right. I would bring up the case that like, power is not necessarily fun. And we say this a lot, but like a good example, I think, is our NeoCube has become kind of an in-house favorite. Like a lot of people in our cube environment have told us that this is my favorite cube you guys offer. And that cube is loaded with a bunch of like junk commons. It's got a bunch of like slow, grindy value engines and like dorky creatures that attack. And there's not a lot of like, oh my God, this card is so ridiculously powerful cards in there. There's no rares or anything like that. And people love it. And I think that's an example of where like power doesn't necessarily correlate with fun. It can. In some cases, playing powerful cards is fun. But like, if you're just like, if you got a bunch of people who like intricate games of Magic and you put a bunch of battle cruiser cards in your cube, like, you know, that's not going to be good for your environment. Similarly, if you got a bunch of Timmies and you try to play like something that's like a complex Johnny cube, like our Neo cube that favors more towards like building these cool board states and powerful synergies, you're not going to have a good time. So like, you kind of have to cater to your audience, right?
There might be people who like that sort of thing too, and then you would build a cube that's all battle cruisers and stuff like that. Like Chris mentioned, a lot of this comes down to feel too, as well as player feedback. Like we said, we cut the One Ring because people didn't like playing with the One Ring, not because we thought the card was too good or anything like that. So you do have to some extent, sculpt your environment to what your own design goals are and what the people you generally play with are. So there are some external factors as well beyond just what the cards say and do, and take that into consideration. But anyway, let's go ahead and close this bad boy out. So thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us and give us your feedback. We actually got some really good feedback on the Peasant Cube yesterday for the first time in quite a while. The Discord is a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, Brawl at this point, and all things Magic. Think of it like your online LGS. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. Our scheduled draft days, we have 4 scheduled draft days. We do our Unrestricted Cube drafts, the cube we're talking about today, on Sunday and Wednesday nights. Our Peasant Cube drafts happen on Saturday nights. We have F&M drafts from a variety of different cubes on Fridays. And we have various Jank Diver Evergreen cubes and user-submitted guest cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings. You can check out our socials on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, on YouTube at youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming on twitch.tv/TeldTalks. So thanks for joining us for a pretty in-depth discussion about the Unrestricted Cube ban list. Teld, I think we should probably get together and do this for the Peasant Cube at some point in the near future, just so that like there's a compiled list of what's actually banned in the Peasant Cube. And next episode, we'll be back with the Thunder Junction Cube review. So that's going to go ahead and do it for this one. Thanks to everybody for listening, and we'll catch y'all next time. All right, Chris, do I have you for a moment?
You do. Yep.
Okay. So, Chris, in the last episode that we all recorded together, you had to bounce right after the episode, so you weren't there for the sign-off. So What I got Teld to do was participate in a little quick event. You might remember we recorded an episode a while back where you guys in a sign-off fought for the title of Nomenclature Norman. Unfortunately, that title was never announced to the public because that episode, for various reasons, didn't get released. But I gave Teld an opportunity to claim the title of Nomenclature Norman for himself, and I'm going to give you the same opportunity. Now, I will tell you, Teld didn't do so hot on this. Teld didn't do particularly good at this.
To the surprise of no one.
Yeah, absolutely fumbled the ball on this one. You know me. I can't remember card text.
You know how Teld is. So the way this works, you might remember, is I'm going to give you the name of a legendary creature by name only, and I'm going to ask you to give me the entire name of the card. And we're just going to see who ends up getting most of these correct. There's 5 total questions. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so first up, your first legendary creature's name is Thalia.
Okay, so wait a second. Am I supposed to read like the text off of the card, or
no? I just want the card name. I want the card name.
I'm gonna go with Thalia and the Gitrog monster.
Oh, that is correct. Absolutely. Yep. Number 1. Okay, we got Thalia down. Teld said Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, which you can understand why he would say that, but unfortunately, Teld was incorrect. So already doing pretty good there. Your second legendary creature's name is Ulamog.
Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Right?
That's it. Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Yep.
Chomp Chomp Boy.
Yep, Teld went with Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, which unfortunately was incorrect, but Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, you got it, 2-0. Next up, Malcolm.
Oh, this is my boy, Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel.
Absolutely correct.
Sexy siren pirate.
Teld wanted to say Malcolm in the Middle, but eventually said Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, which I was surprised is a card he actually knows the name of, given that it's a commander card. But Alluring Scoundrel is correct. So you're 3-0.
He's actually, he kind of is Malcolm in the Middle because he's surrounded by all these sexy merfolk that he's charming with his toned bird body.
Is he toned? Is Malcolm jacked?
In my mind, Malcolm. No, toned and jacked are two very different things.
Oh, okay. I'm neither of those things, so I don't know what.
Tell us more about
They're
what
not
Malcolm
mutually
looks like in your
exclusive.
mind, Chris.
Okay, like Vin Diesel is jacked and Brad Pitt is toned, you know?
Sure, yeah. You know those Amonkhet Avens that are just like they're super buff man arms for some reason?
Tiny little chest.
That's what I imagined. Yeah. Okay, well, let's continue here. Your fourth one, Malcolm's best friend, by the way, is Breaches.
Breaches, Brazen Plunderer.
That's correct. And I want to point out here that Teld not only didn't name Breaches Brazen Plunderer, but also named Breaches Nimble Pilferer, which I believe is Ragavon's name.
Breaches the old-timey pair of pants.
All right, last one to cinch it. You're 4-0. You're on a hot streak here. This one should be pretty easy for you. Kogla.
Kogla the Titan Ape.
Whoa, 5-0. Wow, who could have guessed it?
I smell zero collusion here.
Teld snapped off Kogla and Yadara, by the way.
Frankly, let's be real, Tim. That is the right answer.
It's in our hearts. It's the right answer, but according to my sticky note, that may or may not have multiple names written on it for each of these legendaries. It's Kogla the Titan Ape. So I'm sorry, Teld, but like straight 0-5 against 5-0.
Yeah.
Like that's decisive. So Chris is gonna hold the title.
What's my prize? Is it collusion to clown on Teld? Is that what
I don't appreciate this talk about collusion, first off. And second off, your prize is that you are now Nomenclature Norman until next time we do something like this.
What a trophy.
Which, we love fair, balanced gameplay. So, that was the whole point of the episode. So there you go. You've been crowned Nomenclature Norman.
Hey. Tesserino.
So it's like a Phyrexian buffalo?
Like, ooh,
Cool X1 nerds.
they're the coolest, chillest little animals.
A bevy of otters. Oh my god, that's so amazing. I want it.
Pro player acts like scumbag. More news at 11.
You played man.
Jordan style dunks.
No, don't worship me. Don't worship me.
Get the fuck out of here with that.